Good morning, ladies. Today's episode is titled, What is the fundamental difference between an X-ray examination and an ultrasound examination? As I mentioned in the previous episode, the ultrasound examination uses sound waves that bounce off the transducer in a sector or linear fashion. The sound simply comes out from the transducer, bounces back, and then the next one follows. As a result, it is created on the screen. At a specific time, an image of those reflected elements appears, you could say, and that's relatively easy to understand. On the other hand, the radiological examination using gamma ionizing radiation, its explanation is a bit more difficult. Why? First of all, because most people associate it with some kind of risk, with some danger, and so on. So I made something you could say a visual presentation of how the rays come in exactly. If we imagine that there is an X-ray lamp above, and below is the paper, which is photographic, or today, in a digital system, some sensor that receives those rays. So I will show you how the examination is performed. Radiological, for example, mammography. Notice those salt crystals that are falling at different times to the very bottom. And at the very bottom, a pattern is formed. Of course, this pattern is determined by the structure of the tissue. If we have, for example, a broken bone here, then it's very clear. We can see certain structures. The problem arises when there is tissue, for example, in the breast, that is mastopathic, there are cysts, and there is fibrosis. At this point, this image is too interesting, and therefore sometimes you have to change the exposure parameters. That is, you can say the type of salt by changing the kilovoltage, to what extent all this should penetrate. Yes, in the case of images. Bone is used, so-called sharp rays are used for bone images. In the case of breast images, soft rays are used. A very important thing, just like I showed you this salt, maybe I'll show it again. This salt decreases at different times in our tissue. As long as this salt reaches the DNA itself and completely fills the image, there's no problem. The problem is if our tissue absorbs it, a certain amount of radiation. This is radiation measured in millisieverts, and depending on the dose absorbed. This radiation is the most harmful to us, so if something passes through us to the other side, we shouldn't worry about it. However, if the radiation stays in our body, problems arise because it can damage DNA and actually cause some even irreversible changes. Also, the radiological examination is with this salt that I passed. However, the ultrasound examination requires a reflection. That's why there's also a difference. We can perform a radiological examination practically under any conditions, while an ultrasound examination can only be done in the presence of water, which is the opposite of what we have here in this image. I would like to show you something else. As a supplement to this film, an interesting experiment. Using a Geiger-Miller counter, which you could say is a device for measuring ionizing radiation, and the elements of today's world that you have in your surroundings, which are radioactive, meaning they simply contain elements. In this case, it will probably be thorium, which has a half-life, very long, or helium. It will remain in this element virtually forever and will pose a potential minor threat if anyone uses these items. He had it very close to him. So thank you, and I invite you to the supplementary second part. In this episode, I will show you Geiger-Müller counter, a Geiger-Müller counter used to measure radioactivity, made in Germany, which is functional, one that I bought on eBay. It was shortly before Fukushima. Today we have the next risks. Well, I've been checking all of them for some time now. Objects that are there, maybe not all of them, but some of the objects that are there in my area, in my possession, and that you probably don't even realize the fact that there are objects around you that exhibit natural or even artificial radioactivity that was later assigned What do we have here? Here is the Geiger-Müller counter. This element here is a bit greenish. This is a probe. That is this element that I'm moving to the object being examined. Of course, such a leather or almost leather case and two camera lenses. This one is a lens from today's production. It might look a bit old-fashioned, but it takes beautiful photos. Because this is a design from about 80 years ago. On my left side, there is a lens from World War II that I bought a few years ago. It will serve me for adaptation, for taking photos. You could say a bit more unusual. However, I read in the online literature, of course, this lens is radioactive. It turns out that it contains glass elements, which are here, that contain a radioactive element, which is called track. And I want to show you to what extent and which elements can be radioactive. Even before I start the demonstration and measurements, I want to say that just before the recording and this Gazik here, I polished the front lens so that there wouldn't be any dirt. I thought maybe some dust had gathered here. Is there something? In any case, I wiped it clean. And it turned out that after wiping, this little tube, this cotton swab, is also contaminated with that natural radioactivity, which I will demonstrate to you shortly. The camera is on. Here is the scale. This scale is shown in impulses per second. Next to me, I have what you could call an earbud, which I will try to use here. We'll see how everything will be around the microphone. And now I will be bringing, you could say, the tip of the probe to the lens, and you will hear some crackling sounds. Look how many of these crackles increase as time goes by. As I get closer, the scale is starting to move too. Almost 10. We're going down the lens. We're reaching 20 pulses per second. Look, almost 30. Now we're at the center of the lens, a little less. Now I'm getting closer to this of the swab. It's reaching 5. You can hear those pulses. And today's modern lens practically has none. It doesn't seem to emit any radiation at all. Look, I'm moving this lens away a bit. Here's the swab itself. Oh, something is starting to move. And I'm back to the lens, which is very clearly showing you see how nice it is, like a pointer. It's almost reaching the middle of the field. It's amazing that around us there are devices and objects that exhibit radioactivity. They simply have elements that produce ionizing radiation. And this radiation, look, even through the transfer of such a thing. Here's the swab. We can, in a sense, if it were, I don't know, let's say some cookie that I would have to wipe with poison, then I would have that inside me. Of course, these are very small amounts, but let's imagine a situation where you have this lens. They might sleep, for example, by your bed. If you multiply that by the number of months, years, you'll suddenly find out that over 5 years, you're getting a dose of radiation equivalent to a regular X-ray. And how many things are there in our area untested for radiation? I'll try to also bring some other interesting findings. and show that we must not only look at our mind, our eyes, hearing, smell, and sense of smell, but we must also realize that in today's times, after the explosion in Chernobyl, a terrible catastrophe, after the explosion in Fukushima, and various other modern nuclear pursuits, we are potentially exposed to radiation. I am right now, maybe not actively, but I was a radiation protection inspector at our dental clinic. And I have to say that this course has given me a lot to think about. For example, an interesting fact is that flight attendants or even passengers on airplanes are much more exposed to ionizing radiation than we are here on the surface of the Earth. And on the other hand, there's ionizing radiation. It increases, for example, if we go to some building, to some bunker somewhere deep underground. In other words, if Mr. Putin wanted to hide there, he would obviously be exposed to radiation, even though he himself is absolutely convinced that nothing will happen to him. So with that optimistic note, we conclude today's lesson. And please leave us a thumbs up on our YouTube channel, and see you next time.